Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. And today I'll talk about a pretty controversial topic, but I'll try to do it in a way that makes sense for you. And I entitled this "The Jesusing of Hate" because has been a lot going around lately, and I've been shocked at how Jesus is used in recent years, especially in recent last few months, to cover for hate, to use Jesus and twist the words in order to be able to cover for that. I said in a post about a month and a half ago, I said, the Jesusing of Charlie Kirk is neither about Jesus nor Charlie Kirk. And Kirk's assassination and then raising him to be a martyr, there are people who genuinely feel good about that or feel like that's important, but it was really cynical for most because Kirk was a purveyor of misinformation, of some pretty hateful attitudes. Of course, nobody deserves to go through what he did, and he did foster this idea of open discussion in universities in particular. So, and you can say that, but really his use of scripture and his use of the Bible as a weapon was really very problematic. So it's the casual use of Christianity that is so difficult right now to hurt people who aren't Christian, or even to hurt Christians who aren't of a certain type. And that being using Christianity as a weapon really has to be examined and has to be dealt with. So why is it that so many Christians nowadays, are so willing to toss aside the teachings of Jesus um, in order to gain power? The principles of Jesus are being replaced with the principles of power. Now, I'll talk about three different things that I think give some perspective in this. At once, they provide comfort because we've been here before. We've seen a lot of things and movements like this, especially the rise of religious movements, um, and but also some very troubling things too. Right now, it's clear that there's a lot more interest in religion. Some of it is good. We definitely have more interest in religion among young people. There are there are some upticks or at least flattening of church attendance. Maybe some uptick in certain areas. There's been a lot of reporting about increased downloads of religious materials and things like that. But you have to look at that in two ways. One way is good that people are involved in religion, but bad in that they're using it for purposes of politics and also to scare other people. And there's lots of reasons for that. So let's get started with a little bit of history. And I've talked about this quite a bit, but it's so pivotal in our understanding of religion today, and that is the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening happened in the 1830s and 1840s, and this was a revival of interest in Christianity. Now, it may actually not be as overwhelming as we think it is because actually, in American history, church attendance and associations with the church are a lot less than we realize. In fact, in the colonial era, a lot of people thought of religion as being more of a European thing. So a lot of colonists avoided religion altogether and avoided the practice of church practice. They may be a lot more what we would consider secular than we realize. There's a lot of mythology around this, mythology around the creation of the nation, but that has a lot more to do with us and our narratives and our look back in history than reality. The reality is that during certain periods in American history, there have been great increases in interest in religion, church attendance, revivals, things like that, and they always correspond to great changes in society. I like to say that you can take every big change in society, especially religious movements, and you just go back a decade or two before that, and you'll notice that there's always some sort of a um, great technological change or something very unsettling that happened just before it. And people respond to these, and many times they respond in ways of faith. Uh, the first Great Awakening was a Calvinist movement in the early um, 17th century, sorry, 17th, 18th century, in the early 1700s. And of course, we're very familiar with those. Those tend to be more like Puritans, and there are people like Jonathan Edwards, John Winthrop, a little bit before that, Cotton Mather, and but those were primarily in the North, and those were primarily Calvinist oriented movements. The Second Great Awakening, which happened about approximately a century later, was much different in that it was primarily holiness movement people. John Wesley, who came in the mid 18th century, and and formed the Wesleyans, the Methodists, and so forth. There were the Quakers, there were Mennonites, there were other holiness movement people that really arose in the early 19th century in America. And what they did is they were responding to great changes in society. A couple things. One was just the fact that society was changing dramatically in this time because it was after the American Revolution and the French Revolution of the late 18th century, the rise of Napoleon, for example, and the fact that there's the structures of the aristocracy were breaking down, and Europe was in massive changes during this period. The second big change was there's lots of technology happening around this time. The rise of science. There was tremendous scientific activity. There was tremendous understanding of, people's place in the universe. A lot about cosmology and the where the planets are and where we were in that, but also in physics. We Michael Faraday was in this period. There was all kinds of changes in we started learning about electricity from Benjamin Franklin and others, for example, in this period. So there was tons of change there. On top of that, in the early 19th century, there was a huge movement toward what we would call empathy. They would call compassion at that period, especially in literature. So we cannot underestimate the impact that people had, like Jane Austen, who basically revealed the hypocrisy of the aristocracy, the shallowness of the aristocracy. There was, of course, Charles Dickens, who exposed a lot of the plight of the poor and how horribly treated they were, especially as industrialization was happening in the early 19th century. And then in America, there were many novelists occurring around this time, and the rise of the novel and the rise of reading and newspapers and literacy in general had a huge impact on the way people thought. It made them more compassionate. It made them realize more what people were going through. Uh, the probably the most influential person was Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, which came out in this period, which exposed the cruelty of slavery. Most Americans had no idea how bad it was, especially because most people didn't live on plantations. You had the slave owners and you had people who were adjacent to that, and especially people in the North had no idea how bad slavery really was. So, especially with industrialization of the farms and the massive growth of farms of the plantations in order to make money. With the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s, all of a sudden, this massive increase in productivity started happening. So slavery was kind of a dying institution in the late 18th century, and then slavery became massively profitable in the early 19th century as these plantations industrialized. And then you had the rise of sugar and sugar cane. So what was happening is that all these changes were happening, and people were starting to wake up to the horrible injustices around them, the need for change. The abolition movement comes out of this, labor rights comes out of this period. Um, Women are starting to agitate for suffrage and for improvement in their lives. And all this big stew is happening at once. Part of this change was just the fact that people were reinterpreting what it meant to be Christian, what it meant to what Jesus' words meant. Big part of the holiness movement was that not to be satisfied with your lot, as the Calvinists tended to do, or to be sort of one and done like the Calvinists, but the holiness movement was asking new questions. Would About Christian perfection, essentially. Um, what about the words of Jesus? And how can we be so uncompassionate toward workers, toward slaves, toward women and others? How can we treat them so badly and call ourselves Christian? So that's a big part of this movement as well. The other thing that happens, but with everything, so I would call that the good part of the Second Great Awakening. It was mostly holiness people. There were some Presbyterians and Anglicans or Episcopalians involved, but mostly, and the most famous one of those was um, Charles Finney, who was a Presbyterian pastor, left the church in order to be a great leader in that. There was the Oberlin College, which brought women and black people into the college in Ohio. Just a massive movement around that. The dark side of the Second Great Awakening, though, is that whenever you have a very large increase in religious interest, which this certainly was, it was revival meetings and all of that, you also get a certain part of that movement using religion to harden their views. We definitely saw this in this period, especially in the South, because this period also in the 1830s and 40s, there was starting to be rising opposition against slavery, and there was the people who the leadership in the South, the aristocracy, if you want to call it that, in the South, um, the slave owners in the South were starting to feel very threatened, especially as westward expansion was happening. They started feeling really threatened. In a lot of cases, they turned to religion and they used religion to harden their views. So, out of this period and then into the later 19th century, this is where you get the idea of biblical inerrancy. Um, there was always a strain of biblical infallibility or inerrancy or whatever you want to call it. But those views had softened or were not as hardcore until you really get into the 19th century when when things were changing so much. The rise of science and the rise of especially abolition really caused people to take a very sharp turn toward fundamentalism, and biblical inerrancy comes out of this. And that was in opposition to some of these other things. So that caused a hardening, and that hardening meant that compromise, whenever you get religious people saying, well, God ordained me to be like this, God ordained, white landowners to run everything, to be slaveholders and so forth, then the ability to compromise goes away. And that's clearly what happened in the 1840s and 1850s, is the country sort of broke down, became into two groups of people who were willing to accept and bring in change, uh, to say that the institution of slavery is bad, and people who hardened their views for it. And that cannot be understated by any means. The history of the American church has everything to do with slavery, division of the church from that, division between fundamentalist or those views and views that are more progressive. Goes all the way back to that. So that really, that revival happened. Then you go, for almost 100 years, you have sort of the influence of this revival gradually decreased over time. It popped up every once in a while, and certainly during the Gilded Age, which was very much more about just grabbing what you can and and industrialization and so forth. You and also the reaction to the Civil War and Reconstruction in the Jim Crow era in the South, and then also you have huge technological changes happening in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Well, you could see religious movements bubbling up in the, especially modernist versus fundamentalist things in the early 20th century. My denomination, the Presbyterians, were really fighting over, the inerrancy of Scripture and fundamentalist ideas in this era. And then what happened was, with the shock of World War One, and then the shock of the Great Depression and the shock of World War II, you would think, why would you want to have religion? There's so many, God, where are you in this? In so much cruelty and hatred and all the bad things that were happening in the early 20th century. Well, interestingly, as you get through uh, and into the Cold War, you get through World War II and the Cold War, and then the rise of the Red Scare, then we had another one of these moments, like the Second Great Awakening. And that, of course, is the rise of mostly mainline Protestant churches in the 1950s, in response to the Red Scare. Some of this just had to do with the idea of getting back to normal. There was a very strong sense of, we have the nuclear family, we're going to go back to work. The soldiers have come home. We're going to um, integrate all of the wonderful new inventions that happened into a middle class lifestyle, and a huge part of that was religion. So by the 1950s, we had another really big high point in religion in American life, probably the highest point in history. And that is something like 70 to 80% of people identified as church-going Christians in this period. Of course, the Catholic people who were Catholic were always there, but it was Protestants that primarily really participated in this. And again, you can say, well, what good things came out of that? In my denomination, the Presbyterians, and in many others too, another opportunity for people to become empathetic and see that living out the life of Christ, living, the way that Jesus we would want us to live, starts becoming interesting again, or starts becoming part of our lives again. So this is when you start seeing churches, especially ones that were involved in civil rights, were involved in uh, some of the reform movements that were happening in the 50s and 60s. The Catholics went and had Vatican II. Um, uh, Mainline churches had new confessions, new polity. Now, of course, there were always the fundamentalists and the people that were rejectionists. In my denomination, it was, Church Presbyterian Church of America, which is still an important Presbyterian denomination here, but they split off in the 30s. And the Orthodox Presbyterian Church split off before them, and they split off over the fundamentalist versus modernist arguments. But the remaining Presbyterians, they reformed and they became more interested in civil rights and in justice movements and so forth. And that's why we ended up with the Confession of 1967. You'll find that virtually all of the mainline churches went through some kind of reform in this period, even, say, the American Baptists and so forth. But the more conservative ones, especially the Southern ones, like the Southern Baptists, especially charismatics and so forth, did not participate in this nearly as much. Um, so that's the two sides of the movement in the 50s and 60s, is that you have lots of social change happening. You have people reckoning with that. But what overlaid all of this really leads to that third aspect, and that is the Cold War brought tremendous fear, fear of nuclear annihilation. And, it was one thing to have Stalin and Soviet Union, but then in 1949, you ended up with Mao and communist China. And Americans in this period in the 50s who never would have dreamed about having open displays of religiosity combined with their Americanism, uh, uh, really came out in the 50s because they saw that um, they were the godly nation. America was the godly nation. In God we trust. We started saying the Pledge of Allegiance in schools every day, all kinds of displays. Now, a lot of these were happening before, from World War One and so forth, and through the Great Depression and so forth. But in the 50s, it went into overdrive. In that this idea that we were the godly nation and the communist nations were the atheist nations, and that really created what we think of today as the high point. A lot of people pine back to that period as, that was when America was really Christian, right? And part of this was an anti-civil rights movement, anti-women's rights movement as well. So the kind of the good side is we got social change out of that. Part of the bad side of that is we ended up with a reactionary movement. And the reactionary movement took a couple of turns there. One was this great interest in dispensationalism that happened. Dispensationalism these are the folks that believe in a futurist interpretation of the book of Revelation, but particularly in the rapture. The rapture was a fringe idea. It was, mostly weirdos that believed in this in the 19th and early 20th century. You had John Nelson Darby, and that moved into the Scofield Bible, and you had this rise in in end times theology, but that just really went overdrive in the late '60s with the late great Planet Earth, and then we saw it through the '70s and in the '80s with the rise of the Left Behind movement. But evangelicalism grabbed on to this at the time. So why today we tend to think of default Christianity for a lot of people is this evangelical Christianity, this reactionary Christianity, the one that, uh, before 1978, most evangelicals didn't care about abortion, but then all of a sudden, abortion's the biggest issue there is, and that happened in the late 1970s. Before the 60s, like I said, the idea of rapture and end times theology was really pretty fringy. Of course, you had your believers in it, but pretty not something that was generally considered. But after the '60s, default today is you go to almost any Baptist church and certainly any charismatic church, and that's what they talk about. They talk about rapture. They talk about end times a lot. So that's where that history comes from, and there's so many parallels there. So one of the things that kind of I found very interesting is there was an article by Tom Nichols in the Atlantic and last month, and he asked the question, "What happened to the fear of the apocalypse, of nuclear war, and why don't we have it today?" Because the weapons are still there, the danger of a nuclear accident or a launch or an attack are still there. In fact, in some cases, it's a little more dangerous because you have India and Pakistan who have nuclear weapons pointed at each other. What was the Soviet Union, who had relatively strong controls over things, now is this very much weakened Russia. And you go, and then of course China has their nuclear weapons and so forth. So you go, oh my goodness, why is it that we have seen put that in the background? There are two reasons. One is that controls over nuclear weapons definitely have improved. The probability of an accidental strike is a lot less than it used to be just because of technology and so forth. The heightened Cold War fever is a lot less, even with Russia, even with the everything around. It's not as prevalent. Part of it is because the United States is so dominant. Our military is way more dominant today than it was 50 or 60 years ago. Our technology is unsurpassed. So nobody dares in that respect. But there's the other part of it. And the part of it is that the Cold War has served its purpose for religious reasons. And it no longer really has the same resonance of end times as it did. What has happened, though, is it has moved on. And with Israel forming in 1948, and for people grabbing onto that and saying, oh, this is a sign of the end times. We've moved from an earlier dispensation to a new dispensation. And it looks like it's the beginning of the end times. So, about a month ago, a few episodes ago, I talked a lot about rapture and why it's so unbiblical. And it really is. And if you look at it closely, you can see that the theology is not directly from the Bible. It was cobbled together with the univocality, this idea that Scripture has only one story in it, pulling it together. And even then, when you put timelines together and everything, it doesn't really make that much sense. But people really believe it. And they believe it for these reasons. They believe it for the reason of why is it that why we see today Christians being so darn mean, because it's all about power and it's all about scaring people into submission. So I'd like to offer one other way to look at this. And I'm in Luke 18. There's the story, a parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector. And notice how Jesus responds to this. And then we'll look at Luke 19, which is the story about Jesus and Zacchaeus, the tax collector, the short tax collector that he runs into. So in Luke 18, this is the story. He goes, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. And he said, two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, and even that tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 10th of my income away. But then the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes, and he was beating his breast, and he was saying, God, be merciful on me, a sinner. And then Jesus says, I tell you, this man went down to home justified rather than the other. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So clearly, the Pharisee who is in the law, who is part of the chosen, the elect, is seeing himself above other people. This is so much like rapture theology in the way I see it, is that people tend to adopt it as a way of revenge, of looking at other people, the lost, the unsaved, the non-believers, and that we believers are going to be swept away by Jesus, and we're going to look down and we're going to see those poor unbelievers. They're going to be, they're going to face tribulation, right? That's what rapture theology is. But even if it doesn't say that, Jesus is going to take us away from the bad stuff. But then let's look at Luke 19 for a second and look at which Jesus do you believe in? Do you believe in a Jesus that would abandon people and just take away his favorites? Or do you believe in this Jesus? Jesus talks to Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus is the tax collector. He was the head of tax collectors, and he was a short man who couldn't see, so he climbs a sycamore tree to see Jesus, and Jesus calls him down and says, I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to have a meal with you. And that compels Zacchaeus to give up half of his wealth, to give it away to the poor. He makes amends with others and so forth. And Jesus says at the end of this, he goes, today salvation has come to this house because he too, Zacchaeus, is as much or is a son of Abraham also, along with the Pharisee. It must have been very offensive to the self-righteous, right? But that's what he's saying. He goes, him too. And then the kicker, he says, for the Son of Man came to seek out and save the lost. And I've used this to say, this is the character of Jesus, to seek out, to save the lost, not to give up, not to just blow everybody off. So this is where the tribulation and pre-trib, post-trib, and all of that comes into play. But if you look at this in a pre-trib way, in that the rapture is going to come, Jesus is going to come out of the clouds, he's going to call, he's going to sweep up, seize actually, harpazo, rapture the people to him. That can you imagine then Jesus looking and seeing all those left behind people? No. Jesus would go and he would stay with the left behind. He wouldn't go away. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's not in Scripture at all, because when Jesus comes again, all will come to him. The dead first and then the living. So that's what 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 says when Paul's talking this way. So the idea of separating people and then Jesus not just giving up on people. No, he came to seek them out and to save the lost. And I think that if you look at that Jesus and in that way, you can kind of see that that's in contrast to the Jesus that's being used today by people who are using Jesus for separation, for their political gain, for their power, and their meanness. Because are Christians mean today? Why are they so mean? They are mean. They're mean, kind of like the people who were against civil rights mean. They're mean in the same way that people who were against abolition mean. They're mean in the same way that Christianity was used during fascism mean. That kind of mean. Separating and pushing people they didn't like away. So, in every era, we have to ask this: which Jesus are you allied with? Which Jesus do you believe in? And so, in that respect, what we are seeing today is very much what we saw in the past. Is that you're going to have some people that are really, in society in general, benefiting from an increase in compassion and justice and living standards and all of the things, people investing in the future, investing and and thinking in that way. And at the same time, you're going to have reactionaries that push back and do things like we're seeing nowadays. We had great leaps, great improvements, a more just society. There is more interest in religion, and I thank God for that, and I hope that there's more to come. But I hope it's in a religion of the Jesus that wouldn't leave people behind to suffer. No, believe in a Jesus that compels us. Who the heck would want to think it's righteous or right to be swept up and seized and taken to heaven while people are still suffering here? That's not the Jesus that we know. No, maybe some of us would say, let them go. I'm going to stay behind with the people that I know and love here. So that's why I think the Jesusing of hate that we see is really not about Jesus at all, and it's really not about the object of or the hateful person who's talking. It's really a tool, and it's the tool that we must guard against and fight against today, because people say lots of things about the Bible, especially about theologies that cause us to separate and push people away instead of embracing them and seeking them out and saving them like Jesus does, that aren't really there. So we really should look at this, understand the scope of history, understand that this is not a unique time at all, that there's goodness that's going to come out of this era, and there's a lot to be scared of too. And let's hold that both in tension and fight for the good. So with that, I say thank you for listening, and God bless you.